When people think about disease in the medieval age, they often imagine it as something sudden and mysterious, appearing without warning and disappearing just as unpredictably. But in reality, disease did not spread easily because people were careless or ignorant. It spread easily because medieval life itself created the perfect conditions for it to move quietly, constantly, and efficiently. Disease was not an outsider in the medieval world. It was embedded in daily routine. Homes were crowded. Air circulation was poor. Clean water was limited. Waste accumulated close to living spaces. People lived alongside animals, storage, tools, and each other in ways that made separation impossible. None of this was unusual. It was normal. And what is normal is rarely questioned. This video is not about a single outbreak or a famous crisis. It is about why illness moved so smoothly through medieval society, year after year, without needing dramatic triggers. How everyday habits, infrastructure, labor patterns, and survival strategies unintentionally created an environment where disease could travel faster than people realized. Most medieval people did not ask, "Why is illness spreading?" They asked, "Who will still be able to work tomorrow?" Because work, survival, and illness were tightly connected. As we move through this topic, you'll see why disease was not just a medical problem in the medieval age, but a structural one. And once you understand that structure, the spread of illness no longer feels mysterious at all. Before we continue, I'm curious, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Write it in the comments. It's always interesting to see how far these quiet historical stories travel. If you enjoy calm, deeply explained history that focuses on everyday realities rather than myths, like the video and subscribe. These stories unfold slowly, and the most important insights come later. Now let's look at why disease spread so easily in the medieval age. Not because of panic or chaos, but because of how life itself was organized. Disease spread so easily in the medieval age not because people invited it, but because the structure of daily life quietly supported it. Illness did not need dramatic entry points. It moved through habits, necessities, and survival strategies that could not easily be changed. Medieval society did not create conditions for health. It created conditions for endurance. Disease adapted to that environment effortlessly. Most medieval people lived in spaces that were never designed for separation. Homes were small, crowded, and multifunctional. The same room served as sleeping area, workspace, storage, and sometimes shelter for animals. Heat was preserved by limiting airflow. Windows were few. Ventilation was minimal. Smoke from fires lingered. Moisture accumulated. These conditions were not considered unhealthy. They were considered practical. Practicality mattered more than comfort or cleanliness. Crowding was unavoidable. Families were large. Labor required bodies. Multiple generations often lived together. Privacy was rare. Distance between people was a luxury medieval life could not afford. In such environments, illness moved naturally from person to person without needing any special event. Breathing the same air was constant. Living spaces were also closely connected to waste. Disposal systems were primitive. Waste was stored nearby or discarded close to dwellings. Water sources were often shared with animals, tools, and refuse. Clean separation between living areas and contamination rarely existed. This was not neglect. It was limitation. Infrastructure was basic because resources were scarce. Water, one of the most critical factors in health, was unreliable. Many people depended on wells, streams, or surface water that could not be protected consistently. During dry periods, sources concentrated contamination. During wet periods, runoff spread it. Water that looked clear was not necessarily safe, but visual clarity was the only indicator available. People trusted what they could see. Food storage created another pathway. Grain, meat, and other supplies were kept close to living areas because protection mattered. Storage spaces attracted animals. Animals brought parasites. Parasites moved between animals and humans easily. Separation between species was minimal because labor required proximity. Animals were not external to medieval life. They were part of it. Work patterns reinforced exposure. People worked long hours, often exhausted. Physical strain weakened bodies. Recovery time was limited. Nutrition was inconsistent. Chronic undernourishment reduced resistance to illness even in years without severe shortage. A weakened body becomes a reliable host. Illness did not need to be severe to spread. Mild sickness traveled quietly, passed through households, villages, and towns without being identified as a separate event. What we now recognize as contagion was experienced as general unwellness. General unwellness felt normal. Mobility patterns also contributed. While medieval people did not travel constantly, movement was structured around markets, labor, and obligation. People gathered regularly in shared spaces. Markets, workshops, and communal facilities concentrated bodies. Concentration accelerates transmission. Travelers carried illness between communities, not intentionally, but inevitably. Because symptoms often appeared after movement, connections were not obvious. Disease did not announce its path. It followed routine routes. Routine routes are invisible. Sanitation practices were shaped by necessity, not preference. Cleaning required water, fuel, time, and energy. All were limited. Cleaning occurred when possible, not consistently. Standards varied by circumstance. Cleanliness was practical rather than preventative. Prevention requires foresight and surplus. Surplus was rare. Medical understanding also played a role, but not in the way often imagined. Medieval people observed patterns. They recognized that illness clustered. They knew certain conditions were dangerous. But without the ability to isolate causes at a microscopic level, prevention remained general rather than specific. General prevention is less effective than targeted prevention. Even when people attempted to avoid illness, options were limited. Avoiding crowds was not always possible. Avoiding shared resources was impractical. Avoiding work threatened survival. Choices were constrained. Constraints shaped behavior. Another crucial factor was the rhythm of medieval life. Work, rest, and exposure followed seasonal patterns. Cold seasons forced people indoors. Indoor crowding increased. Air stagnated. Illness thrived. Warm seasons brought different risks through water and food. Seasonality created cycles of disease. These cycles were familiar. Familiarity reduced alarm. When something happens regularly, it stops feeling exceptional. Illness became expected rather than extraordinary. Expectation changes response. When illness is expected, people adapt rather than resist. Care for the sick occurred at home. There were no separate facilities for most people. Sick individuals remained within households. Care required proximity. Proximity facilitated spread. Isolation was rare because care was necessary. Community responsibility reinforced this. People supported each other because survival depended on cooperation. Avoidance was socially difficult. Leaving someone without help threatened collective stability. Compassion carried risk. Risk was accepted. Work did not stop easily. People continued working while ill because labor was essential. Absence threatened food supply. Productivity mattered. Rest was limited. Working while ill spreads disease. This was not ignorance. It was necessity. Urban environments intensified these factors. Cities concentrated people, waste, animals, and trade. Space was limited. Density increased exposure. Resources were strained. Even so, cities were essential economic centers. Avoiding them was not an option. Urban life magnified existing vulnerabilities. Rural life was not immune. Villages shared wells, tools, and labor. Community closeness created resilience and risk simultaneously. Resilience and vulnerability were linked. Disease also spread easily because it did not need to overwhelm systems to succeed. Even minor illness weakened labor capacity. Reduced labor affected food production. Reduced food weakened bodies further. This feedback loop increased susceptibility. Susceptibility compounds. Once illness entered a community, it rarely remained isolated. It moved through networks of care, work, and obligation. These networks were essential to survival. They could not be dismantled to stop disease. Stopping disease threatened survival. Thus, medieval society tolerated a level of illness that modern societies would consider unacceptable. Tolerance does not mean acceptance. It means lack of alternatives. Alternatives require resources. Resources were limited. Another subtle factor was perception. People did not perceive disease as a separate category of event. It was part of life's uncertainty, like weather or harvest. This perception shaped response. When something is perceived as inevitable, prevention weakens. Prevention feels futile. Disease also interacted with stress. Chronic stress weakens bodies. Medieval life involved constant stress, food uncertainty, labor demands, environmental exposure. Stress lowered resistance. Lower resistance increased spread. Spread reinforced stress. This cycle maintained itself. Housing materials contributed as well. Structures trapped moisture. Damp environments support pathogens. Drying spaces required fuel. Fuel was valuable. Dampness persisted. Persistent dampness supports illness. None of these conditions were accidental. They were the result of rational choices within constraint. Medieval people optimized survival, not health as we define it now. Health as a concept was secondary to function. Function required proximity, routine, and endurance. Those same qualities supported disease. This is why disease spread so easily. Not because medieval people failed to understand cleanliness or care, but because the structure of their world left little room for separation, prevention, or recovery. Illness was not an interruption. It was part of the environment. People lived inside systems that allowed disease to move quietly, consistently, and efficiently. Once embedded, illness became another background pressure, like hunger or weather. When we view the medieval age through modern expectations, the spread of disease appears shocking. When we view it through medieval reality, it appears inevitable. Disease spread easily because medieval life made it easy, not through neglect, not through ignorance, but through necessity. Disease did not spread easily in the medieval age because there were no rules or because people behaved recklessly. It spread because the systems that held society together also served as transmission pathways. Medieval life was built on proximity, repetition, and obligation. Those same features that made survival possible made isolation almost impossible. The medieval world was intensely interconnected at the local level. Villages were not loose collections of individuals. They were tightly bound units where work, food, tools, and care were shared continuously. This sharing was not optional. It was necessary for survival. When one person fell ill, others stepped in. When others stepped in, illness moved with them. Care was inseparable from contact. The sick were not removed from society. They remained inside it. Separation required spare space, spare labor, and spare resources. Most households had none of these. Removing a sick person meant losing labor and creating burden elsewhere. Keeping them close preserved function, even if it increased risk. Risk was tolerated because collapse was worse. This logic extended beyond households to entire communities. Villages shared wells, ovens, mills, and tools. These shared points were essential. They saved labor and resources, but they also created convergence. Convergence is where disease thrives. When everyone must pass through the same spaces, illness gains efficiency. Medieval towns amplified this effect. Streets were narrow. Buildings leaned inward. Waste accumulated close to where people walked and worked. Markets brought large numbers of people into confined areas regularly. Goods passed through many hands. Hands touched surfaces. Surfaces were reused. Transmission followed economy. Trade networks also played a role, even when travel was limited. Merchants, messengers, laborers, and officials moved between settlements. They carried information, goods, and illness. Because symptoms often appeared later, connections were not obvious. Disease traveled invisibly. Work obligations ensured that people continued to move even when conditions were unsafe. Skipping work was rarely an option. Missing labor threatened food supply, income, or social standing. Even when people felt unwell, they often continued working. This was not denial. It was necessity. Working while ill increased exposure. Exposure became routine. Routine normalized illness. Once illness is normalized, response weakens. Another important factor was the absence of recovery space. Recovery requires rest, warmth, nourishment, and time. Medieval life offered limited access to all four. People rested when they could, not when they should. Illness lingered. Lingering illness increased the window of transmission. Extended exposure increases spread. Nutrition compounded this problem. Diets were often monotonous and marginal. Even in non-crisis years, many people lived close to undernourishment. Undernourished bodies resist illness poorly and recover slowly. Slow recovery lengthens transmission. Transmission feeds on weakness. Weakness was widespread. Seasonal labor patterns intensified cycles of disease. During planting and harvest, workloads increased dramatically. Fatigue rose. Immune resistance fell. People gathered in close proximity for extended periods. Disease moved easily during these peaks. Seasonality synchronized exposure. Cold seasons forced people indoors. Heat was conserved by sealing spaces. Air stagnated. Moisture increased. Smoke accumulated. These conditions stressed bodies and facilitated respiratory illness. Indoor survival created indoor spread. Warm seasons brought different challenges. Water sources were more exposed. Food spoiled faster. Insects thrived. Illness followed different paths, but the same principle applied. Necessity dictated behavior, not prevention. Prevention requires choice. Choice was limited. Medical care, where available, was integrated into daily life rather than separated from it. Healers visited homes. Care occurred in shared spaces. Tools were reused. Knowledge focused on comfort and endurance rather than isolation. Isolation was impractical. Even when people recognized that illness could spread, their ability to act on that knowledge was constrained. Avoiding others meant avoiding work, care, or obligation. Avoidance threatened survival. Survival always won. Community expectations reinforced this. People were expected to contribute even when unwell. Asking for exemption placed burden on others. Burden risked resentment. Resentment threatened cohesion. Cohesion mattered more than health. This social pressure ensured continued participation, even under risk. Urban authorities sometimes attempted regulation, but their reach was limited. Rules about waste, markets, or movement were difficult to enforce consistently. Enforcement required manpower and resources. Both were scarce. Inconsistent enforcement created gaps. Gaps allowed disease to persist. Even when authorities acted, measures were reactive rather than preventative. Action followed visible disruption, not invisible transmission. By the time illness was recognized as a problem, it had already spread. Recognition lagged reality. Another crucial factor was the cumulative nature of exposure. Medieval people were exposed to multiple stressors simultaneously: physical labor, poor nutrition, environmental conditions, and chronic uncertainty. Each stressor weakened resistance incrementally. Incremental weakening is hard to notice, but disease notices. This cumulative vulnerability meant that even common illnesses had outsized impact. What might have been minor became persistent. Persistent illness maintained transmission chains. Chains rarely broke. Breaks require interruption. Interruption was rare. Household structure further reinforced continuity. Multi-generational living increased contact across age groups. Vulnerable individuals were not isolated. Care flowed both ways. Care sustained life and disease. Another overlooked element was the perception of illness as part of the natural order. Disease was grouped mentally with weather, crop failure, and misfortune. It was expected, not exceptional. This perception reduced urgency. Urgency drives prevention. Without urgency, behavior remains unchanged. People adapted emotionally rather than structurally. They accepted illness as a recurring challenge rather than a solvable problem. Acceptance preserved mental endurance, but allowed physical vulnerability to persist. Acceptance stabilizes psychology, not health. The absence of institutional separation was decisive. There were no widespread systems designed to remove illness from circulation. No spare housing, no reserve labor, no large-scale isolation capacity. Capacity limits response. Medieval society operated at near full capacity most of the time. There was little slack. Slack is what allows prevention. Without slack, everything is reused. Reuse spreads disease. Even recovery created risk. As people began to feel better, they returned to work before full recovery. Partial recovery still allowed transmission. The cycle continued. Cycles embedded disease into life. Disease did not need to overwhelm society to succeed. It needed only to persist. Persistence was guaranteed by structure. Structure mattered more than awareness. This is the central truth. Disease spread easily because medieval society was optimized for continuity, not interruption. Interruption threatened survival. Disease exploited continuity. Once illness became part of the background, it required no special conditions to move. It moved with work, care, trade, and obligation. Stopping disease required stopping life. Life could not stop. Thus, disease remained. When we view this from a modern perspective, it is tempting to blame lack of knowledge or poor decisions. But knowledge without capacity changes little. Medieval people made rational choices within harsh limits. Those limits favored survival over health. Disease spread because survival demanded closeness, repetition, and endurance. Those same qualities made illness efficient. This was not failure. It was consequence. The medieval world was not careless. It was constrained. And within those constraints, disease found a permanent place, not as an invader, but as a companion to daily life. Disease in the medieval age did not spread easily only because people lived close together. It spread because the entire structure of medieval society was designed around continuous interaction, limited interruption, and constant reuse. Nothing in daily life was disposable, temporary, or isolated. Everything was shared, reused, repaired, and returned to circulation. Disease benefited enormously from this reality. Medieval life operated in closed loops. Food was grown locally, processed locally, stored locally, and consumed locally. Tools were made, repaired, and passed down. Clothing was reused until it could not be repaired anymore. Living spaces were occupied continuously. There was no concept of clearing space to reset an environment. What existed remained in use until it physically collapsed. Illness moved along these same loops. Once disease entered a household or a community, it rarely left entirely. It faded, weakened, and resurfaced, circulating through the same people, objects, and spaces. This persistence made disease feel like a condition of life rather than an event. Events begin and end. Conditions simply exist. Medieval disease was a condition. One of the strongest reasons disease spread so effectively was that medieval society could not afford interruption. Interruption meant lost labor. Lost labor meant reduced food. Reduced food weakened bodies. Weakened bodies spread illness more easily. This feedback loop ensured that work continued even when illness was present. Stopping work was more dangerous than spreading disease. This logic governed decisions at every level. Individuals worked while ill. Families continued shared routines. Communities maintained markets and obligations. Authorities avoided measures that disrupted productivity for too long. Survival required continuity. Disease exploited continuity. Another major factor was the absence of clear boundaries between spaces. Modern societies rely on separation, clean versus dirty, living versus waste, sick versus healthy. Medieval society relied on proximity. Boundaries existed, but they were porous. Waste was removed, but not far. Animals were housed, but nearby. Water was drawn, but shared. Porous boundaries allow movement. Movement allows transmission. Objects played a larger role than we often realize. Tools, containers, clothing, bedding, and furniture circulated constantly. They were handled by many people. Cleaning was limited by water, fuel, and time. Objects retained traces of illness long enough to pass it on. Reuse was unavoidable. Avoiding reuse required surplus. Surplus did not exist. Seasonal pressure intensified this system. During peak agricultural periods, labor demand surged. People worked longer hours in closer coordination. Fatigue increased. Resistance weakened. Shared tools and spaces multiplied exposure. These peaks created waves of illness. Between peaks, illness never fully disappeared. It lingered at low levels, waiting for conditions to favor spread again. Medieval people lived inside cycles of sickness rather than isolated outbreaks. Cyclic illness feels normal. Normal illness is tolerated. Tolerance reduces intervention. Another structural factor was housing permanence. Buildings were occupied continuously by generations. There was no concept of vacating and sanitizing a space. Moisture, residue, and contaminants accumulated slowly. Living environments aged along with inhabitants. Aging environments favor persistence. Even when houses were cleaned, cleaning focused on visible dirt, not invisible risk. The concept of invisible transmission did not exist, but more importantly, the capacity to address it did not exist either. Capacity matters more than awareness. The medieval economy also encouraged disease spread through obligation networks. Guilds, markets, and communal labor tied people together. Participation was mandatory for survival and status. Avoidance was costly socially and economically. Avoidance threatens belonging. Belonging mattered more than safety. Medical response further reinforced circulation. Care took place where people lived. Care required touch, shared space, shared materials. There were no separate recovery zones for most people. Healing occurred inside transmission pathways. Healing and spreading were intertwined. Another critical issue was time. Medieval life operated at a slower pace, but recovery did not slow disease. Slow recovery increased exposure windows. People remained infectious longer. Long exposure allowed illness to move through entire networks before fading. Time favored disease. Nutrition played a silent but powerful role. Even when food was available, diets lacked variety. Repetitive diets weakened resilience. Illness that might have been short-lived became persistent. Persistence keeps disease active. Stress amplified everything. Chronic stress affects resistance. Medieval stress was constant. Food uncertainty, labor pressure, environmental exposure. Bodies were rarely at full strength. Disease exploited this weakness. Weakness does not need to be dramatic. It only needs to be consistent. Even social values reinforced continuity over isolation. Caring for the sick was a moral obligation. Refusal was unacceptable. Community survival depended on mutual aid. This aid required contact. Contact spread illness. Choosing isolation over care threatened cohesion. Cohesion was essential. Authority rarely intervened decisively to isolate disease because isolation disrupted order. Order preserved survival. Survival preserved authority. This priority hierarchy shaped response. Disease was tolerated as long as order held. Another overlooked factor is that medieval disease did not need to overwhelm to succeed. It thrived by remaining present. Constant low-level illness kept populations weakened without triggering drastic response. Visibility drives response. Low visibility prevents it. Disease that is always present becomes background. Background threats are managed emotionally, not structurally. This is why medieval accounts often describe illness as something expected. It was woven into life narratives. People planned around sickness the same way they planned around weather. Planning around illness normalizes it. Normalization prevents elimination. Even attempts at reform faced resistance. Measures that threatened productivity or routine were viewed as dangerous. People feared disruption more than disease. Fear shapes choice. Choice favored continuity. The medieval world lacked slack. Slack is unused capacity, unused space, unused labor, unused resources. Slack allows systems to pause, isolate, and recover. Medieval society operated near full capacity at all times. No slack means no pause. No pause means no break in transmission. Everything was always in use. Even death did not interrupt cycles fully. Loss created labor gaps that others filled. Filling gaps increased exposure. The system compensated instantly. Compensation preserved function. Function preserved disease pathways. Disease adapted perfectly to a world optimized for endurance rather than separation. This is the uncomfortable conclusion. Medieval society did not fail to stop disease. It could not stop it without threatening survival. Every choice was rational within constraint. Illness was the price of continuity. Continuity was the price of survival. Disease spread easily not because medieval people were careless, but because their world could not afford the alternatives required to stop it. Once illness became embedded into daily structure, it no longer needed opportunity. It had access, and that access was constant. Disease in the medieval age did not merely spread easily. Over time, it became structurally permanent. It settled into society the same way dampness settled into walls or hunger settled into planning. Illness was no longer an interruption to normal life. It was woven into expectations, routines, and assumptions about what life required and what it would take away. One of the most important reasons disease became permanent was that medieval society lacked recovery space. Recovery is not just about medicine. It is about margin. Margin means spare time, spare food, spare labor, spare space. Medieval life operated with almost no margin at all. Every resource was already assigned a purpose. When illness appeared, there was nothing in use to absorb its impact. When someone fell ill, work still needed to be done. Fields still needed attention. Animals still needed care. Tools still needed to be handled. Food still needed to be prepared. Illness did not pause obligations. It layered itself on top of them. This layering ensured that disease remained active even when communities tried to cope. Coping replaced prevention. Prevention requires interruption. Interruption was too expensive. This created a rhythm where sickness was expected to circulate quietly without ever being fully addressed. People adjusted emotionally and practically. They planned for reduced strength. They redistributed tasks. They accepted lower output. These adaptations kept life functioning, but also allowed illness to persist. Persistence became normal. Once illness is normal, it stops triggering alarm. Another critical factor was how medieval people understood causation. Illness was not seen as a single, isolated chain of transmission that could be broken. It was seen as part of a larger pattern of misfortune, weakness, or imbalance. This worldview did not encourage targeted interruption because interruption seemed futile against something perceived as environmental. When a problem feels environmental, people adapt instead of resisting. Adaptation allowed disease to continue circulating. This does not mean medieval people were unaware that illness spread. They observed patterns. They noticed clustering. They recognized that certain conditions worsened sickness. But recognition without capacity changes little. Knowing that illness travels does not stop it when the routes are unavoidable. Routes were unavoidable because they were the same routes that sustained life. Daily contact was not optional. Touch, proximity, shared space, shared tools, and shared labor were foundational to survival. Removing any one of these weakened the system. Removing all of them was impossible. Disease did not exploit ignorance. It exploited necessity. Another reason disease became permanent was the cumulative weakening of bodies over time. Medieval populations rarely returned to full strength between episodes of illness. Nutrition fluctuated. Work demands remained high. Environmental exposure continued. Bodies existed in a state of partial recovery. Partial recovery extends vulnerability. Extended vulnerability sustains transmission. Even mild illness could tip weakened bodies into prolonged sickness. Prolonged sickness increased exposure windows. Exposure windows overlapped. Disease chains rarely broke completely. The result was not constant crisis, but constant background illness. Background illness is difficult to fight. Fighting requires recognition. Recognition requires contrast. Contrast was absent because illness never fully disappeared. Housing permanence reinforced this condition. Living spaces were occupied continuously. There was no practice of emptying, resting, or renewing environments. Moisture accumulated. Organic material accumulated. Residue lingered. Even when cleaning occurred, it addressed appearance, not underlying persistence. Environments aged along with occupants. Aging environments support long-term survival of pathogens. Objects aged too. Bedding, clothing, tools, and containers absorbed repeated use. They passed through many hands. Cleaning was limited by water, fuel, and time. Objects were rarely removed from circulation unless completely unusable. Continuous circulation equals continuous exposure. This also applied to public infrastructure. Wells, mills, ovens, and markets operated constantly. Shutting them down disrupted survival. Keeping them open maintained disease pathways. Keeping them open was necessary. The medieval economy reinforced this permanence. Exchange depended on physical presence. Goods changed hands directly. Inspection involved touch. Trust required proximity. Distance reduced reliability. Reliability mattered more than safety. Markets did not pause because of illness. Pausing meant hunger. Hunger was immediate. Illness was gradual. Gradual threats lose priority. Priority shapes response. Disease lost priority because survival pressures were more urgent. Another important factor was the way medieval authority evaluated success. Leaders were judged by their ability to maintain order and continuity, not by their ability to eliminate illness. Eliminating illness was unrealistic. Maintaining function was achievable. Function became the goal. As long as people continued to work, pay obligations, and avoid unrest, authority tolerated disease. Intervention occurred only when illness threatened order directly, not when it harmed health alone. Health was secondary to stability. This hierarchy of values ensured that disease remained a background condition rather than a central target. Community values reinforced this as well. Care for the sick was expected. Abandonment was unacceptable. Care required contact. Contact spread disease. But refusing care threatened cohesion. Cohesion mattered more than containment. Containment threatened survival. This moral framework ensured that even when people feared illness, they continued to engage with it. Fear did not translate into separation. It translated into endurance. Endurance sustained disease. Another subtle factor was time perception. Medieval life was cyclical. Seasons repeated. Work repeated. Illness repeated. Repetition dulls urgency. When something returns regularly, it becomes expected. Expected threats do not provoke drastic action. They provoke preparation. Preparation in medieval life meant adjustment, not prevention. Adjustment accepted disease rather than removed it. Disease also benefited from uneven impact. Not everyone fell ill at the same time. Some people remained functional. Functional people compensated for others. Compensation prevented collapse. Preventing collapse prevented systemic response. Systemic response requires visible failure. Failure rarely became total. Even during severe illness waves, some level of function persisted. That persistence delayed radical change. Disease remained manageable rather than overwhelming. Manageable problems persist. Unmanageable problems provoke transformation. Medieval disease remained manageable enough to endure. This endurance was reinforced by the lack of alternative models. People could not imagine a society structured differently. Separation, isolation, sanitation infrastructure, and medical intervention required resources and concepts that did not exist yet. Imagination is shaped by environment. An environment of scarcity produces conservative imagination. Conservative imagination preserves existing structure. Existing structure preserved disease. Even when communities attempted small changes, those changes were constrained by resources. Building new infrastructure required labor and materials that competed with food production. Diverting resources risked hunger. Hunger was a stronger threat than illness. Thus, disease was tolerated because fighting it threatened survival more directly than enduring it. This trade-off was rational. The permanence of disease also shaped attitudes toward life and death. Illness was expected. Loss was familiar. People adjusted emotionally. This adjustment reduced panic, but also reduced motivation for radical prevention. Radical prevention felt unrealistic. Realistic response focused on coping. Coping strategies do not eliminate causes. They manage effects. Managing effects allows causes to persist. Over generations, this created a stable equilibrium where disease circulated continuously at manageable levels. This equilibrium was not healthy, but it was sustainable within constraint. Sustainability mattered more than health. Health was fragile. Survival was negotiable. The medieval world chose survival. This does not mean medieval people were indifferent to illness. They cared deeply. They suffered. They feared. But fear without capacity produces endurance, not elimination. Endurance shaped culture. Culture reinforced structure. Structure preserved disease. This cycle explains why disease spread so easily and remained so persistent. It was not a failure of care, intelligence, or morality. It was the outcome of a society optimized for continuity under scarcity. Disease fit perfectly into that optimization. It did not need to overcome resistance. It needed only to exist. And existence was guaranteed. When we look back at the medieval age, the spread of disease appears overwhelming. From the inside, it appeared ordinary. It was one of many pressures people learned to live with, like hunger, cold, and labor. Illness became background. Background conditions are the hardest to remove. They shape life quietly. They define eras without announcing themselves. And that is why disease spread so easily in the medieval age. Not because people failed to stop it, but because stopping it required a world that did not yet exist. Disease spread so easily in the medieval age not because people were careless, ignorant, or indifferent, but because the structure of life left no room for separation, recovery, or interruption. Medieval society was built to survive scarcity, not to protect health. Every system prioritized continuity. Work continued. Care remained close. Spaces were reused, and obligations were maintained even when illness was present. Illness did not arrive as an external disaster most of the time. It moved along the same paths that sustained life itself, through shared homes, shared labor, shared tools, shared water, and shared responsibility. Stopping disease would have required stopping daily life, and stopping daily life meant hunger, instability, and collapse. Faced with that choice, medieval societies endured illness rather than risk survival. Over time, disease became a background condition. It shaped expectations, weakened bodies gradually, and circulated quietly without demanding dramatic response. People adapted psychologically and practically. They planned around sickness the way they planned around weather or food uncertainty. Adaptation made endurance possible, but it also allowed illness to persist. This is why medieval disease feels shocking to modern eyes, but felt ordinary to medieval ones. What we see as failure was, in their world, a rational compromise under extreme constraint. Health required resources, space, and slack that did not yet exist. Survival did not. Understanding this changes how we judge the past. Disease was not simply something medieval people suffered from. It was something their world was structured to carry. Thank you for staying until the end. If this explanation helped you see medieval life more clearly and realistically, support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments.